Welcome to the Pitchwerks podcast. I'm Scott McTaggart. Over the last 20 years, I've been a sales rep, a marketer, a manager, an executive, a consultant, and an advisor. This show is designed to give you access to my list of contacts so that you can learn more about how to present your ideas at work and succeed in your career.
Startups and salespeople, marketers and managers from the Epicast network in Pittsburgh. It's the Pitchwerks podcast.
Make it easy. If you make a list of 100 reasons to do something and one reason not to, there's no guarantee that the 100 reasons aren't all stupid. You know, that's just the way that it works. It's not a quantitative decision.
Are you ready to learn something? Today I've got a professor, and we're not even going to have to pay tuition in order to get his insight. His name's Dr. Calum Matheson. Calum is coming in to talk to us a little bit about arguing, debating, and ultimately making a decision. Obviously, these are all very valuable things. Calum's doing a little bit of consulting on the side as he teaches and coaches the various arguers and debaters at the University of Pittsburgh. All right, Pitchworkers, we're back again. Happy Wednesday. We're sitting here with Calum Matheson, actually Dr. Calum Matheson. I don't want to sell the man short. How you doing, Calum?
I'm great, thank you.
You know, it's not too often that we get to have, a proper man of letters here on the program. I have to take full advantage for marketing purposes at a bare minimum.
Well, I hope it happens someday.
I like where we're going already. I don't know Calum, and that is actually interesting unto itself because, as you all know, typically the folks who come on here have crossed paths with me at some point or another. And actually, I was reading my local paper, and I read this article about how Americans really just don't seem to know how to make an argument. And I said, hey, I have a show about that. So we're going to talk today a little bit about what actually persuades people in a way maybe that some of our other guests haven't been able to. So, Calum, before we get started, why don't you tell everybody exactly what it is that you're teaching these days?
I've been teaching an argumentation class. It's a class that teaches principles of argument broadly. So that means standards of evidence, how to make logical arguments, how to string those things together to persuade, and persuade beyond logic as well, emotion and appeals to ethos or credibility too. And finally, and this is a kind of neglected part of argument, I think, it also teaches how to make judgments based on the arguments that other people make. So how to evaluate both your own arguments and evaluate the arguments that you're exposed to, and how to persuade people to come around to your side and how to understand their perspectives as well.
It's kind of the rules.
It's kind of, yeah, in a way. It's based in a sort of democratic idea of how to be a good citizen that participates in a democracy, how to persuade people to, persuade public opinion, or how to determine the right course of action for a group of people. But those same principles that apply to democratic leadership and citizenship also apply to everything else that you do. Good argument skills make you sort of give you the equipment to think clearly and to persuade others in any situation.
Who is it that is most interested in this class at this point? Like, if someone is going to be taking this class, where are they probably headed? Is it someone who has more of a political science kind of a bent, or are we talking more, your legal, future lawyer types?
It's a general education class. So we get people from all over. You certainly get a lot of people who are interested in something like the law, but you also get a lot of people like from the hard sciences. The most interesting to me is that the class seems to turn up a lot of computer scientists. And I think,
really?
Yeah, a lot of computer science students. And I think that the reason that that's true is that they like the format, that it's a little bit like programming. Programming is an abstract version of spoken persuasion. Those tend to be some of our most successful students too. They really get into it. They love formal logic. And they also love the idea that you can persuade without formal logic. It's both terrifying and exciting.
Now, one of the things that I took away was from reading the article, and I'll make sure the article is linked on the website because it is a very, for me, encouraging, uplifting kind of an article, because I love the interest that it tells me that your students have, right? That gives me hope that people will try to do the right thing when they have an argument, right? How did you even start teaching this class? Was it something you targeted, or did they come to you and they said, hey, there's an opening?
So this is my second year here in Pittsburgh. Before this, I was a debate coach at Harvard for 6 years, and I was a competitive college debater before that. So I'm a professor of communication studies here, but I got into communication through debate and public argument, not the other way around. Well, while I was getting my PhD at the University of North Carolina, I did some stuff teaching public officials how to speak in public, how to make good arguments and be persuasive.
Yeah.
And I do a little bit of that advice for other people who need it as well.
Are you doing political exclusively, or are you also working with businesses?
No. My specialty is the thing I'm interested in is how to make good decisions and how to persuade. So any place where people need help on the sort of principles of persuasion. I've done it for a nonprofit group that does work in Iran. I've done it for public officials in North Carolina. It's it's a broadly applicable thing. It's the universal currency of persuasion and decision making, and that's what I'm interested in. Political, business, all across the board. It's a useful skill.
That's tremendous.
So this class is something that I'm kind of naturally prepared to do, I guess. I'm also the director of the debate program at Pitt, which both does intercollegiate debates, sort of technical, high-level policy debates, and also does public debates that are supposed to teach this kind of thing or demonstrate it for a broader audience. 7 years ago, I was in a graduate program for military history and theory, and I ended up getting my PhD in communication studies, studying psychoanalysis and the way that people imagine the end of the world. Those two things don't naturally overlap, but they're also not entirely different. There's some common thread that binds those things together. So I think we do fail people in the sense that we want them to make decisions very early. And, these aren't the days where you're the village blacksmith because your parents were the village blacksmith or whatever. But at the same time, I think that we both tell students that they can do anything that they want to, that they can grow up to be the president, that any career is open to them. And while that might be formally true, I think that degree of freedom is sometimes terrifying if you combine it with pressure to make a decision right now and the implicit or explicit promise that if they get this wrong when they're 20, then, they're never going to recover by the time they're 60 or whatever.
And this is true. They say, you can make a lot of money if you get into cybersecurity or, whatever the job du jour is, right? Or you can retire early, or then that was one of the ones that was used on me. So I actually got started in telecommunications because my father said, I wish I had started. He had worked at AT&T at the time. He said, I wish I had started here when I was 18 years old. I could be retiring with a full pension at 48. You should do that. And it's not my father's fault that I, took a job there, But again, I didn't know how to come to a conclusion. And I was an adult. I could vote. I wonder how likely it is that anyone is gonna feel any pressure to make a well-informed decision if they've based their whole career on an emotional response, what they feel is a tradition, a duty that may not have actually been saddled on them, So it's an interesting question for me to sort of explore a little bit. Now, I have to believe you're also talking to some folks who are a little bit older, maybe non-traditional students.
Oh, sure, yeah. And, I teach graduate students as well. So some of the graduate students are older than I am. That's just the way it is.
Yeah. And how are they responding?
Well, the graduate classes I teach are less about argument, but the same principles kind of apply. That one thing I think is important for all of them, and I think older students tend to get this in a way that younger students don't, is that it isn't just about what someone has told you your career path can be. Like, can you retire early? Can you make a lot of money? The first question isn't that. The first question is, what do you want? Like, if those things don't matter to you, it doesn't matter that you make a lot of money, then choosing to be a biomedical engineer or, doing cybersecurity or whatever will be miserable and you'll be bad at it.
Yes.
So
very likely, at least. I suppose there's a lottery ticket that wins somewhere, but yeah.
Oh, sure. Some people do things that they hate and they're great at them, but for the most part, you won't apply yourself and won't develop the necessary set of skills to enrich your talents to be good at something unless you already have a general sense of what your values are, and that's where to begin, I think.
So what can we do for these younger students? Like what's a good exercise for a younger student that's not yet into higher education to start looking at things more objectively?
Well, I think that this is kind of the point that, the traditional pitch for a liberal arts education is that you should be a well-rounded thinker and exposed to everything from English to physics. that's fine, but you should also see that as another opportunity. It's an opportunity to test many things and figure out the ones that you're both good at and motivated to do. And I think that one thing that we can do is kind of maybe stop pushing the idea that these decisions have to be made very early before people get a chance to test out different options, and give them a little bit more time to develop in a couple of different areas before they make a decision about what they're going to be good at. In these days, getting a bachelor's degree is kind of equivalent to what having a high school diploma was like in my parents' generation.
Right.
You need, most students who want to be advanced in some professional field will go on for further training after their undergraduate. So use your undergraduate as an opportunity to figure out what you want to do and what you're good at, and then figure out the means by which you will apply it. You can make that decision later if you want to, but I think the very first thing we can do is teach students that the decisions that they make now are not irrevocable, that there's always another path, there's always another option to start over or to take a set of skills that they've already learned and transfer it to a new area.
And then, obviously, that transitions into, you've got your degree, now you need to find out which job to take.
Sure.
Right? Same idea. Let's assume for a moment, you know how much your student loans are. You know where you want to live, more or less, because those are things that are malleable, right? I can be a lawyer in California. I can be a lawyer in Pennsylvania. It's my choice. And, if I want to be close to my Nana, that's fine, right?
Sure.
If I'm establishing that list, I'm doing it for the purposes of determining which one to go with. So and I realize that, this is a very loaded use of the word right, but what's the right way now to evaluate? I've got these choices. Where do I go next?
Again, I think it's important to start with what you think you value. So figure out what it is that you want. So imagine that you're comparing a bunch of different equations and you're asked to figure out which one is more than the other. That's kind of a similar situation. Which one of these things do you value more? You can't do that if all the variables are undefined. Those are the values that you stick in yourself, that you have to figure out what it is that you want. Like, how do you choose between a job that pays more and a job that is more humane, or a job that makes you happier? The way to do that is to figure out what it is that you want. Does it matter to you that you make more money? Does it matter to you that you need more money? Does it matter to you that you get to retire early? Do you get to do something that you love? All of those things make a difference, but to make a comparison between different options, you first have to begin by sort of reducing them to a set of values. There has to be some stable locus for comparison between different things.
You got to make a list of what your priorities are.
It's the same way that you evaluate two arguments. When one person says, I think we should do this because it'll save us money, and the other person says, I think we should do this because it'll be more fun, the question is, which is more important, more money or more fun? So there has to be some grounding. In argument theory, there's a name for this. They call it a stasis point. It's a point where different competing claims, and that's how you can understand different job offers. All of them are arguments that are being made for you. You should take this job because it will do this thing which benefits you in this way. Someone else says you should take this job because it does this thing that benefits you in this way. The only way to compare these competing options is to find the point where that's sort of least common denominator, where you can say, this is the question at hand. The question is, I have this value, which of these best fulfills this set of values? And that's how you compare them. So I think it's difficult to make a decision unless you know on what grounds you intend to make that decision.
But they do. They do
right?
Every day, and they make them and no disrespect intended, I help a lot of young people, right? I speak at colleges. I advise, that sort of thing. I do what I can. I do mock interviews with students. I do whatever it is that I can because I've been very fortunate, and I try to make sure that I'm helping people get to at least the point I'm at. And I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a source of constant frustration to find out the decision that they made and then the rationale behind it.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, for example, often I see someone takes a job because someone showed interest, which is, and I'm going to borrow from you said something before we started recording about how you need information from outside of the equation, or to compare, to better understand what life is like inside the equation. So I'll say, if you were dating someone, would you only date them because they were the one that asked you? Or do you only date people who ask you? And you get these empty looks sometimes because they realize, Arrested Development style, I've made a terrible mistake.
Yeah, right. There's a reason why we say good opportunity and bad opportunity rather than just opportunity. Just because something is possible doesn't mean that it's the thing that you should do. So, yeah, someone shows interest or you have an opportunity to do something, it may still not be the right decision for you. So I think one problem, this is another thing that we teach in argument, a big reason to learn the rules of informal logic or how to argue or persuade is really to convince yourself how to make better arguments. And one thing that I think we see all the time is that people make a decision and then they figure out why they made the decision rather than the other way around.
I read a book that actually studied this for specifically that reason, because that was the thesis that they were trying to test, was that they felt that the book is called Sources of Power. It's a great book. I read it 20 years ago and it still sticks with me. Firefighters they know what they're going to do before they start doing it, and other decisions, because again, this is what interests me.
In a way that can be good. Like there are two different ways to do it though. You can make a decision because the expertise that's required to make that decision is so thoroughly ingrained with you and you're so certain about what you're going to do, how you would do it and why you're doing it, that you don't need to think about it. You don't need to deliberate about it. You don't need to take a moment to figure out what you're doing because you already know, because that is who you are and that's been built into you through training or natural inclination or whatever. The other way to do it is to make a snap decision, realize that you might be wrong, and then try to convince yourself and others that you made it for the first reason, not the second reason.
Right. I meant to do that.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right? So, and I apologize. I started out sort of in left field. I'm sure you were probably sitting there going like, why in the hell are we talking about like young people and career opportunities and whatnot? But I think it's disingenuous to just jump in the middle and be like, well, this is how argument is done. Because sure. I think the first thing is this is how decisions are made.
Yeah.
I think for the purposes of brevity and efficiency, a lot of times, this is Calum. Calum knows about debate. Calum, say hi. And you're like, hi. And it's like, Calum, what's the right way to tell somebody they're wrong? And, I guess, for some people that's a useful interview, right? But I don't think that argument is the point. I think understanding how the evaluation is done is important. And I think in order to make it real, you have to start with like these decisions that get made by these people who haven't yet had the opportunity to be educated.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That's what argument is. Argument is the art of decision in a way. It's not about, that's what persuasion is. Persuasion is about influencing a decision. Learning the rules of evidence or learning how to persuade, those things are about learning how people decide. It begins with decision.
And I played a little bit of the shell game with you in the beginning, and I didn't necessarily tell you where I was headed with it because I wanted to see organically kind of where we started off. But now that we can establish that there are good decision-making opportunities in these people's lives that they can, and I realize, it's an embarrassing thing to admit that maybe you did something because I'm a blacksmith because my father was a blacksmith and his father before him, right? And you don't want to necessarily admit that you didn't make the decision as objectively maybe as you think you did. Once you identify that you're making decisions, it changes the way you look at the way decisions get made. I think a lot of people feel as though they've been robbed of power, and it's just a good place to start. So I'm looking at job opportunities. I've made my list. I have my idea of sort of like I want to live someplace where, I don't know, the air is clean, and I want to work someplace where they're going to pay me a fair wage. I don't need to make all the money in the world. I have my list, right? Have you ever heard of something called the Ben Franklin Clause?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, so this is like an old sales thing, right? And I mean, I'm going way back now. This was really common. They used to do film strips for the people who sold cars, like in the 40s and 50s. They would teach you, if you were a Ford man, they would teach you to sell a Ford like this. You'd say, well, Scott, I'd love to buy this Ford pickup truck, but I've got to go home and talk to my wife, which is a pretty common, let me get away from the table. I need to collect my thoughts. It doesn't necessarily always mean that you need to talk to your wife is the point of the starting point here. And then they were supposed to counter with, well, Dr. Matheson, you're a smart guy, aren't you? Right? Kind of lead you down the path a little bit. And yes, I am a smart guy. Obviously, you know who Ben Franklin was. Well, yes, of course. One of the founding fathers of the United States of America. That's very good. Yes. I told you were a smart guy. Well, One of the ways that Ben Franklin used to make a decision is that he would make a list of pros and cons. On the left side of a piece of paper, he would make a list of all the pros that would support doing this thing. And on the right side, everything that didn't support that decision. And then whichever list was longer, that's what he would do, right? And this, I guarantee you we can go snag somebody out there off of Warrington Avenue right now, and they know what the Ben Franklin close is because it still gets taught by sales managers to this day.
Sure.
Now, I guarantee you have a very sophisticated vernacular for what exactly I'm talking about. But the point I'm making is that there are also traps in making a list of priorities.
Well, this is why you have to learn how to think clearly and make logical decisions. If it came naturally to everyone, there'd be no point in teaching it. But, the problem with something like the Ben Franklin close
is gorgeous, isn't it?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's beautiful in its simplicity. So there's this old thing in Aristotle that I promise not to talk about Aristotle too much. But
no, that's fine.
There are three modes of persuasion for Aristotle: ethos, pathos, and logos. And those are the appeal to character, credibility, the appeal to emotion, the appeal to logic. What's really important about those things is that they aren't using emotion or using credibility or using logic. They're appeals to the audience's sense of logic. And something like the Ben Franklin close is a perfect example of logos. It's an appeal to the sense that an audience has of their own logic,
right,
rather than a demonstration.
You're a smart guy, aren't you, is how I've always seen it started.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's so good. You could soften someone up by complimenting them and then make it easy. If you make a list of 100 reasons to do something and one reason not to, there's no guarantee that the 100 reasons aren't all stupid. That's just the way that it works. It's not a quantitative decision.
Or that you took one thing and turned it into three.
Oh, sure.
Or you restated it.
Yeah. I would like this. I would enjoy this. I want this. Those are all the same. Right?
Well, I would like it. And I know that people that know me want me to be happy. Mm-hmm. Right? That's a great way to double up on one. And my father, who taught me a lot of these things, he used to study all of these, right? And mostly from an academic perspective. He used to just you got to listen to this one I heard today, right? Because we were talking about what you talk about from a completely different perspective. Because my father did, the same kinds of things that we talk about here on the show. He was, heavily involved in sales and entrepreneurship, and we would sit and we would talk about the things that people would believe or the setups that people would use. And my father's pitch was always actually a lot smoother than that. He used to go, and remember, I told you he worked with AT&T. He says, look, we're AT&T. If you don't talk to us, you've just been shirking your responsibility, because they were the biggest name in what they did, right? So it was very simple for him just to say, you have to at least know where we're at, right? So he didn't need the Ben Franklin close or any of these other different things. How do I do that? How do I get to a point where I can identify my list as being safe, an anchor point for where I'm going to make my decision?
I would strongly recommend that everyone takes the argumentation class at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, said, that Stasis.
Are you taking registrations right this minute?
I'm not teaching it till the fall, but many other people are teaching it right now. Feel free to go and register. Pitt.edu.
There you go.
That stasis point is a set of values. So the idea of a stasis point also sort of developed by, although it didn't originate with, Aristotle, and Aristotle made a similar claim. So imagine a court case. Imagine that there's a murder trial going on, that there are a number of things that have to be established along the course of a murder trial on both sides. Is the person dead? Were they killed intentionally? Does that killing count as a murder? And does the person that we've accused, are they the ones who committed that murder? All of those things are all aspects of the same question. They're all questions that lead up to the stasis point. The stasis point is this individual guilty of murder? Should they be punished for it? That question has a bunch of sub-questions, all of those things I just said. You have to establish them all to come to the conclusion. And what we've been talking about before, it's similar to that set of values. It begins with an understanding of what it is that you want. To make a decision begins with the sort of stasis point in a decision. If you have a bunch of reasons on one side for something and a bunch of reasons on the other side, is which of those reasons speak to the things that actually matter, which of those are important to you, and which of those are important and making the ultimate decision. You can create a bunch of arguments, bad ones,
Yes.
for anything and against anything. The art of persuasion is about this. We live in a world that's defined by probability and not by certainty. That's just the way that the universe functions. So you're never sure about everything. You never can be. Maybe you shouldn't even want to be.
So
but
you
you
think-
begin by what's important.
For example, you think this job pays very well, but you may not know what every other job like it is paying. So you determine the probability that you have enough information to make the decision. Am I following?
Sure. This is why hundreds of thousands of people decided to go to law school in 2007 and 8. They were like, there's a recession. I can do this and be rich. We're always going to need lawyers. But if everyone else thinks the same way, there's a glut of labor. And all of a sudden, it's not as attractive as it used to be. My brother was a factory worker in Michigan, which sounded like a very good option in the mid-1980s. But, 20 years later, not so much. So you never have perfect access to information, even if there were certainties about how you were going to decide, even if you could evaluate your own strengths and desires with total certainty, the information in the world around you changes. You don't know it all, and that's always the way that it works. So
We used to say that houses always go up in value.
yeah, right. Yeah.
I got stung on that one too.
Yeah, sure, they did until they didn't.
They did until that's my line. That's the one I always, it does until it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, it's been a tough year. And I can only imagine how you've been pulling your hair out watching some of the arguments. And honestly, watching people probably fall for some of the arguments has been every bit as much frustration as anything else for you.
Oh, it's great.
What stood out in this past year? And I'm not asking you politically to take any sides. I'm speaking strictly as a mechanic right now. What stuck out for you?
It was a referendum for the most part about how people felt about the character of the person that they might be voting for. And you can think back to George W. Bush in 2000. People said the same thing. There was this line that people repeated a lot. He was a good person. He's the kind of guy that you'd want to drink a beer with.
I remember.
Right.
Yeah, that was a really common, I think that was like a cable punditry kind of a go-to line. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was kind of the genius of his campaign in some ways, that people make decisions for reasons that are mostly about character. Some people make hard, rational decisions where they weigh up all the options. They have the Ben Franklin test where they're like, we've got climate change on one side and taxes on the other or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you make a determination. But the percentage of people who do that is fairly small. And the candidates, by focusing on each other's character, probably made the right decision in a sense. Not the right one for the future of democracy, but the right one for the situation that they were in.
Strategically, they were playing their cards.
That's right, because if they went too high, if the whole thing was about policy and the whole thing was about what this would do to interest rates or, what was happening on the ground in Syria, most of the electorate doesn't know and doesn't care. This is a key lesson in persuasion, is that people make decisions based often on incomplete information, not just because the information is not available to them, but because all you do all the time is make decisions, and you have a finite amount of time to devote to any decision. Very few people spent thousands of hours thinking about what candidate they were going to vote for, checking to make sure that every news story that they heard was real or whatever. They made decisions based on whatever was available to them at the time, and for a large part, that means feeling. So,
if I'm the person who is in the business of professional persuasion, I sell Microsoft, that other person sells Apple. How does someone start incorporating that into a day-to-day persuasion now? What's a good starting point?
I think the very first thing to do is to realize that you're always being asked to persuade, and you're always being persuaded by other people.
Oh my God, you listen to the show. No.
Well,
we started off from like week one. We're like, even if you're a heart surgeon, you have to close people on the idea that this procedure could save their life if they would just agree to it.
Oh, sure. I mean, if you're a research scientist and you're trying to get the government to give you a grant to research something, you're still persuading them that they should give you money.
Yes.
If you're a college student, you're writing a paper, you are writing an argument for the most part. I believe this because of these reasons. That's an argument. You're persuading someone, and then you're persuading them in another way. And you should also give me a good grade, and I'm confident because,
And then you graduate and you get a job and you want to start your own business and you ask a bank to fund it. And then, you find your first customer and you tell them that it's worth taking a risk. There's 100 of these. So one of the things I look for is like how to present ideas that are not just different ideas, but also different presentations.
Here's one suggestion I have about that, and I'll use a political example for this as well. Yeah. I think humility, strangely, is one thing that people have largely given up on. That there's a million different products, for example, that you're competing against. And the easiest thing that you can do, and then this is precisely what the 13-year-old would do if they were in charge of the ad campaign. They would say, our thing is the best thing that's ever been made, and there will never be a better thing than this. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. I think
and see the lamentations of the women. I don't remember the whole line. I wish I did now.
Conan. Yeah. No, it's great. See your enemies driven before you and hear the lamentations of their women. Yeah.
There it is.
The easiest impulse is to just be like, our thing is perfect and there will never be another thing that's as good as this thing. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened and will solve every problem. I think one thing that you don't hear very much is people who say, this thing is very good for these reasons, and sort of acknowledge its limitations. That doesn't mean that you also have to say, oh, and it won't do all this stuff, and it's bad in these ways, or maybe you want to think about our competitors for these. But it's to combine a positive message with a message that isn't overwhelming and obviously hyperbolic.
Okay.
So the Scottish National Party, I'm Scottish, my father was an immigrant, all that stuff. The Scottish National Party, when it campaigned for independence in 2014, did an excellent job of this. The whole campaign was branded as yes. So the question of do you stay in the United Kingdom could be called no. Do you dissolve the United Kingdom by dissolving Act of Union? You could say the whole thing is no. It's about leaving. It's about refusing. It's about not being British. It's about opposition to the English. All of those things are possible campaign messages, and they didn't do any of that. What they did instead was to only say yes. They said, yes, independent Scotland. Yes, the future of our people. Yes, hope. And the big argument was, there will be risks and there are dangers in doing this. And they said, have hope, chance.
Well, because typically people say no until they have to say yes.
That's right. And so making the whole thing about saying yes was brilliant in a way. They never attacked their opponents. They never said, we are better than the Tories. They never said, and the campaign has become more negative over time. But like in 2014, they never did any of that. What they relied on instead was making a positive statement about their brand to, adapt a different world's terminology, and waiting for their opponents to trash it and look petty and low. And they didn't make wild claims that could easily be dismissed. They didn't say, and Scotland will be the next empire to conquer Europe or whatever. They just said, this is a hopeful thing that we would like for our people, and we think that this is a good vision of the future. You can't say that's wrong because there's no falsifiable claim to it.
Yeah.
And if you try, you look mean and petty. You made the negative argument that they wanted to make, but you've made it about yourself.
It feels insanely timely, too. I feel like this is where the world is. Right now, they don't want zero sum. They don't want scorched earth.
And it doesn't have to be that way, and it's not good for you and it's not good for anyone else. You should want competition, and you should want competition that you are favorable in. And one way to do that, unless you think that you can exterminate all your competitors by being just absolutely superior to them, you don't need to advertise if you're right about that.
Yeah, I suppose that is the truth. Calum, I appreciate the time you've spent with us.
Thanks so much.
It's been insanely informative, and I've had a lot of fun with our time. If someone wanted to reach out to you, how would they do that?
You can find me through email at matheson@pitt.edu. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me.
All right. We've been talking to Dr. Calum Matheson about something that we all need to know a lot more about, how people make decisions, how you can be better at helping them make those decisions. That does it for our time with Calum Matheson. Don't forget, this whole thing comes together at pitchwerks.com. That's PITCHWERKS. There you're going to find our blog, the podcast episodes. Again, thank you tremendously for tuning in.
The Pitchwerks podcast comes to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a production of the Epicast Network and McTaggart, LLC. Engineering and production by Buzzy Torek and Nick Miller. For more information, show feedback, and ad sales, visit pitchwerks.com, PITCHWERKS.com. On social media, find and follow the show on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram using that same brand name, PITCHWERKS.